Okay, I want to call to order the meeting of the Policy and Services Committee, Tuesday, December 9th, 2014. Would you please take the roll?
Councilmember Klein. Chair Price.
Here.
Councilmember Sharp.
Here.
Councilmember Schmidt.
Here.
3 present.
Okay, thank you. If there are any members of the public here who are interested in speaking to issues not on the agenda, please identify yourself. Okay, and if you want to speak to items on the agenda, please submit a speaker card. Do we have the speaker cards?
No, ma'am.
No, any speaker cards?
Out there, but haven't received.
You haven't received any speaker cards. Okay, thank you. Okay, agenda item number 1, triennial external quality control review of the Office of the City Auditor. If we could please have a staff report.
Thank you. Good evening, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you. For the period under review, the organization's system of quality control was suitably designed and whether the audit organization was complying with its quality control system. The purpose of that is to provide reasonable assurance that we followed applicable government auditing standards. And the reference to the audit organization's system of quality control refers to our policies and procedures that we have in place to implement the government auditing standards. So we engaged with the Association of Local Government Auditors, also known as ALGA, to conduct a review. ALGA's peer review committee has developed a low-cost program that is recognized as meeting the intent of the peer review requirement. The peer review committee coordinated our review and sent the Toronto Auditor General and Deputy City Auditor for the City and County of Hawaii, Honolulu, as our reviewers. Our review period was July 1st, 2011 through April 14th, 2014. The period was slightly shorter than a full 3 years because it coincided with my start date as the city auditor. The peer review team reviewed our policies and procedures manual dated October 2014 to ensure that they incorporated the requirements of the government auditing standards. They also reviewed a mix of audits and non-audit work that the office did during the review period to ensure that it was performed in accordance with the government auditing standards. The reviewers concluded that our policies and procedures manual and our work were in compliance with the standards. They also acknowledged the high quality of the audit reports and the professionalism of the audit staff in our office. They did, however, suggest improvements in 3 areas to enhance our compliance with the standards, but acknowledged that our revised procedures manual is comprehensive and complete and will serve my office well in the future to ensure that we meet all of the requirements of the government auditing standards. Those 3 areas were to ensure that we document supervisory review of audits that had occurred before issuing our reports. They identified this because in some instances they saw that supervisory review occurred after the fact. They also recommended that we appropriately evaluate our independence with regard to how performing a non-audit service might impact our independence for conducting future audits, and that primarily pertained to the work that was conducted as special advisory memos. And the third was that we assess and document our assessment of risks of fraud that are significant within the context of our audit objectives for each audit. And we've developed a risk assessment process that will do that. Although the reviewers did not put a comment in the report, they commented to us verbally and told us that they also commented on it to the council member with whom they met, that they strongly believe that the requirement for our budget to be reviewed and approved by the Office of Management and Budget prior to being submitted to the council for approval each year creates an independence impairment, and encouraged me to engage in a conversation with the council in the future to change that practice. That's something I'll do at a later date. As you'll see from my responses to the reviewers, I've already addressed all their comments through my revisions to our policies and procedures manual, which our staff is using now for audits that they are now starting. This concludes my comments, and I'm ready to answer any questions you might have about the review or the review process.
Okay, thank you. Colleagues, questions, comments? Councilmember Schmidt?
Yes, I should mention that I was the member of the city
Yes.
council to talk to the to visitors. In general, they were interested in oversight, how the council provided oversight to the audit functions, the follow-ups that the council made. They were especially interested in the independent position of the auditor, one that she reported to the council and not to the city manager. Raised a question about budgeting, whether the city manager had some control over budget operations or the personnel in the department. We talked through that. At the end, I said if they did have any recommendations, the council would be very interested in hearing things that we might improve. I note that they did not have any, so I guess we're happy with the way the council has been operating with the auditor and the independent perspective the auditor has. Let's see, to go to your comments, Hillary, Harriet, you mentioned the audit stopped when you came. I would think it'd be valuable to have the audit go overlapping into the period you were here.
So the reason we stopped it is that the bulk of the work that they would have been reviewing would have been completed during that time, and the work that started was not completed, is not yet completed. So we've got audits that started when I came and they haven't been issued yet. And so a cutoff date for that period, it wouldn't have included this work anyway. And so stopping it also gave me a point of reference for saying if there were things that weren't being done, I can make sure that we're the next review will cover a full 3-year period.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds a little funny for an auditor to.
It's actually fairly common for when a new auditor comes in that they might ask for a peer review at that point and say, this is a point to start and give me direction for going forward.
Yeah. Okay. On the second recommendation, the GAS 2.12 dealt with non-audit work. Now, sometimes that's clear, but there must be a fuzzy boundary between what is audit work and non-audit work. Could you help define for me a little bit those boundaries and what you define as non-audit work?
So it's interesting that you comment on that because the boundary is not quite as clear as you might think. The government auditing standards define non-audit services as anything that is not an audit. It gives a clear definition of what an audit is, but there are a lot of activities that auditors may do. For example, an audit involves evaluation of audit evidence, what we call evidence, and analysis to draw conclusions based on that evidence. And sometimes there's analysis being performed in non-audit work that some people might say, well, that should have been an audit. Others try to justify it as non-audit service, and it's not really as black and white as it could be. As I think you know, I'm chair of ALGA's Professional Issues Committee, and we've been working with the Government Accountability Office in Washington, D.C. to give them some input on the issues that government auditors face in trying to draw that line between an audit and a non-audit service. And so they are looking at revising the standards beginning next year, and when they do, that's one of the issues they're going to address. But the biggest issue that comes up with that is, when you're doing some work as non-audit work, does it impair your independence when you do an audit?
Yeah.
And that was the concern they raised.
Let me bring up a couple things. The ethics committee policy that we now have, the auditor sits as one of the members of that. I assume that's non-audit work.
I have not sat on a ethics committee. We had some input into the ethics policy that was developed, but it wasn't really a formal. Oh, the hotline. Oh, okay. 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 That is considered non-audit work, but it is also a common function that auditors use, and that's one of the areas that's not clear. If you're doing an investigation because of something like that, how do you address it? And that's one of the issues that has been raised through ALGA to the
So your role
GAO.
in any investigation is not driven by audit.
Correct.
It's your best judgment on it.
Correct.
Okay.
And I would also add to that most of the investigations, we aren't doing them directly. Most of them are being done by a department director. A lot of them have involved personnel types of activities or issues, concerns, and so most of them have been done by someone in people, strategy, and operations.
I assume, though, at some point you're going to run into a case where there's cash is going missing or in funny places and a call for an audit. So those two are going to overlap at some point.
Correct. And I've been in that situation before, and we have done it as an audit. In my last audit organization where cash was missing, we ended up doing it as an audit.
This issue is, does your non-audit work create a conflict with the audit work?
Right.
So if you discover in the hotline that cash goes missing and then you audit that, is that a conflict?
It depends how you approach it. So if you do the audit as a way to look at what weaknesses allowed the cash to go missing, and you're looking at quantifying it, you're sort of building that investigation into your audit process and doing an audit at the same time, it would not be an impairment.
Let me follow up with one other area. The performance report. I assume that's non-audit work.
That has actually been treated as an audit. And so one of the things with the standards, so the survey is not an audit, but we don't actually, the citizen survey, but we don't actually conduct that. We contract that out. The performance report, we do it, and it has been done as an audit. But one of the things, the way the standards are written, is that you apply the standards that are applicable based on your audit objectives. And that one is a lot of compilation of data from departments rather than analysis. And so we're not drawing conclusions, so it doesn't impair our independence because we're not drawing conclusions based on that data.
But you are, as a council, setting targets for individual.
We don't set targets for other departments. So if there's targets in there, a lot of those measures those performance measures don't have targets. They just say this is how we performed. But where they do have targets, those have been set by the departments, not by us.
Right. The targets, look at the numbers that you have audited and say that's our target for this year.
No, and we don't audit those numbers. We collect the numbers. Sometimes if something doesn't look right, we go back to the department and we say, can you please explain? But we're not actually auditing those numbers.
So we should not treat the numbers in the performance report as audited numbers.
Correct.
And yet you say you are doing audit activities.
They've been treating it in the past as a performance audit, and but they've also been putting in there some comments about what they do and what they don't do. I think that it does need to be clearer about what they're not doing in that report, because I think that it hasn't been completely clear the extent to which we audit or don't audit, but every one of those numbers is not audited.
So when the report comes out, do we ask you about the numbers?
You may.
Okay, and you will clearly define.
We will be
those you
clear.
stand behind and those that were given to you. Huh? Okay, I think those are the questions I had on the letters.
Okay, just one point of clarification on the comments you made about what the review team said to you about not reporting to the city manager, and it's important for independence that we report to the council. In the context of what you said about them raising the concerns about budget and the city manager should not be involved, those are the ones that they didn't put in writing, but that's the comment they made to us to address in the future.
That's right. I guess it's the issue is the city manager is the one who presents the budget to the council, and it has the auditor's office as a part of the budget.
Correct.
So they were wanted to make sure that you retained independence over your office.
Correct.
They were not influenced by budget decisions.
Correct.
Okay.
Councilmember Sharp, I will recognize you before you do. Okay.
So is Berkeley an elected auditor? I forget.
Yes.
So in place, how is the budget typically done?
It varies. Some of them are done the way ours is. In the offices where both of these auditors were from, both of them, their budgets go directly to their legislative body and not through their budget office.
So they go directly.
Correct.
And is that more people do it that way than not?
I don't know exactly. I would say that you would probably find a mix of both.
Sorry. And they were suggesting then that that you put together a budget?
Correct.
separately, and it goes
Correct.
to the council directly as opposed to going through.
Correct. What the Auditor General from Toronto told us is that what he does is he follows the general guidelines that they put out for the rest of the city, but that his budget does not actually go through the normal budget process for review. It goes straight to their council for review.
So are you going to raise this issue with the city manager and come to us and talk about that, or do you feel it's not necessary to do that?
I would like to address it with him and see how he wants to approach it, but I think that since they raised the issue, we should probably address it.
So I think it'd be a broader issue than just the auditor then. I mean, my sense is we would probably have the budgets. I think that might involve the other CAOs as well. They might, if you do it that way, they may have to, because it would seem weird just to have the auditor as opposed to both the city attorney and the clerk's office.
Correct. I understand that. So would you want me to coordinate with them to bring the
Well, I think-
issue forward?
I think that it is a broader issue. I think I'm not going to suppose how the best way for you all to handle it, frankly.
Yeah, there is a footnote to it is that the workers belong to unions that cut across the boundary.
Oh, good.
Decisions on allocation of common things like office space and IT and so on are allocated to each department and office.
So,
So a good portion of the budget is driven by these generalized decisions.
right, and so, I mean, if you were to come with us, I definitely want to know how other cities do it. I mean, I'd want to understand, because what Councilmember Schmidt says is, correct, so. Anyway, I think I'd like to see the models exactly how it's done in other places, and what that looks like and how it feels.
Right, and I think you're still going to see a variety of things, but we can come up with something. And as I said, the Auditor General from Toronto told us he follows their general guidelines. He doesn't just say, I want the sky, so, okay.
City Attorney Stem?
Thank you. So we're happy to consult with the auditor and the city manager and the clerk to maybe update our procedures in this area. We obviously need to work very, very closely with the budget staff because the expenditures of the city in total have to match up with the revenues. So we have to fit within that structure, and there are these common expenses. In my experience here, I have felt as a CAO that I've been accorded a certain amount of deference by the budget director and the ASD director and the city manager in terms of the preparation of my budget. And I'm sure that's because I'm not just any other department head. But happy to talk with the auditor about the special concerns that have been raised and whether there's any adjustments that need to be made.
In the city clerk's office.
Yes.
If I can add something, if you want to pass me that wireless mic. Certainly the budget comes before the finance committee meeting through the hearings, and council has a opportunity to look at the budgets that are allocated for the offices, and the CAOs have an opportunity to meet with council members on a regular basis. And so I think there are enough safeguards in the process that if a CAO wanted more funds or wanted more positions, that that could certainly be raised with council members and brought up in finance committee meetings and things like that. So just as another note to the
to just say no. The city manager's office has spoken.
No, I just it's just
Just reminding of his other projects.
there's other processes in place.
So I did want to say, though, make it clear that I'm happy to explore it, but I am completely agnostic. It's not a yes, I'm not advocating for, I'm not against it. It's completely agnostic at this point. I did want to actually briefly ask you, so 2 people come out when they do these audits. And really what they're doing is auditing the auditor, right?
Correct.
That's what a peer review is.
Correct.
Which is sort of interesting.
We should do that.
Audit the council?
Council to council.
Yeah.
Council,
So
council.
I didn't tell you, we're going to have former council member Price be the council auditor. Council members next
Get
year.
something done around here. I'll do it, I'll take it on free.
Well, like all other council work. So I actually wanted you to briefly tell me, how long are they here for? What do they do? What does the process look like?
Sure. So they're on site for a week, but the process actually starts a few months ahead of time. And we have to fill out a document that gives a lot of background about our office, gives them history of our peer reviews, lets them know what kinds of comments were on prior peer reviews, because they will look to make sure that those recommendations have been implemented. They review our policies and procedures. In this case, they reviewed 2 sets of policies and procedures, the ones that existed when I came on board and then the new ones. And I had to update those policies and procedures because they did not reflect changes to the government auditing standards that were made in 2011. So they had to review 2 sets of procedures. We send them a list of all the work that we've done in the last 3 years, and then they select from that. They do a sample of projects to review.
You send this to them before they come in?
We send all of that before they
Do they
come.
have boxes of
Oh,
documents?
well, no, we send them a list, and then when they're on site, they actually look at the
So they
documents.
show up with a list.
Correct.
How many days are they here for?
They're here for a week.
So they're here for a week, and then do they interview all of your staff and you, and then obviously Councilmember Schmidt? Do they talk to anyone else?
This time, it depends on the organization. Some organizations, they want them to talk to other people. They asked to talk to one council member, and they wanted to talk to a council member from the committee we generally present to. So that's when I went back and contacted the 4 of you. And so sometimes they might talk to departments and say, what kind of service. It really depends on how the audits are structured. And if they do a lot in one department, they might go to a department and talk to it. This time they opted only to talk to a council member.
Give them like a conference room or an office?
Right.
They sit in the
Councilmember Schmidt came, and they were using the vacant assistant city manager office while they were here.
And then they basically go through the files, and if they have any questions, they ask the person who did the audit
Correct.
what they did.
Correct. All of the staff were available to answer any questions.
All right.
And we did charge rent to the auditor's office for that office.
Okay, well, thank you. These are spectacular results, and your responses were great. One quick question. You referenced SAM in the past, which is a special memo
Special advisory memo.
Now, that was under the prior auditor, and that was discontinued. And does this have any relationship to non-audit activities?
That's exactly what it was.
Okay.
They were treated as non-audit activities.
Okay. Okay.
And I think their specific concern with those was when you looked at them, they looked like audit work, and that we should have been following our independence requirements when we did those.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, just wanted to clarify that. That was my understanding. Okay, so I'm willing to entertain a motion that we recommend, you can see the bottom of page 1, to City Council acceptance of the triennial external quality control review from the Office of the City Auditor.
Second.
Okay, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? 3 in favor, 1 absent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, and just a reminder that Councilmember Schmidt would like to leave by 8. So if we could be focused and try to move right along, that'd be great. So, oh, good. Yes. Oh, I know that. I know that. Okay. So, agenda item number 2, discussion of process for City Council pre-screenings of projects requiring zone changes. And welcome, and could we have a staff report?
Thank you, committee members, Chair, and committee members. My name is Jonathan Late. I'm the Assistant Director for the Planning and Community Environment Department.
How long have you been here now, Jonathan?
Just over 2 months. And I guarantee by the end of the year I will know the department's name.
We change it every 4 months.
Great. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And this first item that I have is related to pre-screening, and I wanted to sort of at the outset let you know what we were expecting from you in terms of a recommendation. This is an initial conversation, and what I'm looking for is some broad guidance, and I've identified a couple of points in the staff report, and I'll mention those again as in my oral comments. But I fully intend to come back to the committee with a draft ordinance working with the city attorney's office, and we can get into a little more detail about some of the recommended approaches going forward. The purpose of the pre-screening, I think the committee members are aware, it's an opportunity for the council and the community members to have an initial understanding of a project, and for community members to express some comments or concerns that may affect them. It allows the council to provide some overall guidance and for policy issues that may be of particular interest in the community, whether it's height, density, parking, open space, any number of planning issues that may be touched by a particular project. And in many ways, it helps an applicant or developer as well, because it begins to at least frame the boundaries of a project and allows them to go forward and make some refinements based on the feedback that's been received. There's not a lot of these pre-screening requests that we get, and I asked staff to look back in the last 5 years, and there were 2 pre-screening requests that were filed for one property. And that's an active case now. One of those was a PC request, and that's now being changed to a rezoning request. This is at 2755 El Camino Real. And there was a project at 395 Page Mill that had gone through the pre-screening effort. And then there were 2 other projects that actually the developer had withdrawn. So the universe that we're talking about, at least in the last 5 years, is about 3 cases. The 2 withdrawn ones were 3980 El Camino Real and 355 Alma Street. And they may not have gotten up to any council. It was probably just an initial concept. And so that speaks to when these requests are made. It's either before an application's been filed, or if it's after an application's been filed, it's before any public hearings have been conducted. So I understand that there's been some criticisms, perhaps, of the pre-screening process, and maybe the fact that we have so few might be one of the reasons why we're trying to address this this evening. But staff has sort of identified a couple of key points that I think would be helpful if the committee would focus on, at least initially. And one is the current program is voluntary. And so the question is, do we want to continue to have that be voluntary, or is there a desire to make it mandatory? And if mandatory, what are the universe of projects that we're interested in seeing captured under that mandatory program? And are there other projects that we would continue to want to see on a voluntary basis? And depending on how we answer those two questions, I think there's a third opportunity for us to streamline the effort so that people who are requesting this process can get before the hearing authority or the meeting sooner. And whether that meetings with the PTC or the City Council, if there's some thoughts about whether it should just go straight to City Council, or if there's value in still going through a process, or leaving the option open as it exists today. So those are the three main broad points that I'd be interested in the committee's feedback, and of course any questions that you have, I'd be happy to try to answer those as well.
Okay. Councilmember Sharp.
So I think I would strongly support that we make it mandatory that we do the pre-screening. I think you've captured most of it: substantial zoning regulation or district map change proposals, comprehensive plan amendments, including specific plans, and any other development project or permit entitlement application, including a major alteration or expansion of existing use, etc. I think that pretty much covers the universe of it. I mean, that's at least the way I read it. Is there anything else that you think?
I think correct. I think the ones that have the broadest impact are the ones that challenge the zoning standards or the general plan, the way it's been drafted, or planned communities.
So if we adopted it as mandatory that you had to come to council on a pre-screening of this for any of these, would all PCs be covered in that then?
I think we'd want to be.
I was going to ask you
yeah.
if we should just say all PCs as well.
I would recommend being specific to the type of application.
I saw you had specific plans. So how about proposed development agreements? I mean, would that be covered by the universe of what we have here, or do we have to be specific?
I would include that because it's conceivable you could have a DA sort of, well, let me think about that. If you're, I guess I need to understand the process a little bit more, but if you're processing a development agreement, you're also going to have to get the necessary entitlements, and so that likely would include your PC.
But it sounds like 3 captures both PCs and development agreements.
Yeah.
When I read that,
3 is so broad that it captures pretty much everything.
so maybe it's too broad. I mean, that's really what I'm trying to get to.
Right.
Is it too broad?
I think it is. I think it creates some ambiguity to, if we want to be clear about what projects need to qualify, I think it's PCs. We could include DAs. And any zoning code or general plan or a comprehensive plan amendments that would affect the key policy issues that are sensitive to the community, such as height or density or parking, and perhaps there's others that we need to list.
Probably any comprehensive plan changes, right?
Possible. There are some projects where it may not be seeking that may require a comprehensive plan amendment that doesn't have a huge implication to some of the broader policy issues. It may not be a density change or a map change. Maybe it's a clarification of some language. I don't have an example of what that would be, but I see Jim reaching for the microphone, so I think that I'll...
No, I did just want to state the obvious, that any project that did require a comprehensive plan amendment would have to be approved by the council.
Absolutely.
So the real question, again, in this case, goes back to pre-screening. So it does seem that some threshold requirements on the, well, I don't know, go either way. How many comp plan amendments do we typically have, really?
Not many.
Many here.
Not many, and legally, we're only allowed to amend a certain number in a given year. I don't think we've tripped that recently or come close to tripping that. So I guess if you were to err on the side of caution, you could have a requirement for a comp plan. I mean, what's the harm, I guess, if you have a pre-screening effort to explore anything that would require a comp plan change?
So what's a district map change proposal?
So that's your base zoning map. So if you wanted to change either a district
Or change the
boundary.
zoning?
Yeah.
So is it any zoning change is a district map change?
Yes. If you were, well, no, a zoning map change is a district. The district map is the zoning boundary. So if you wanted to change, you, yeah, you can change. For instance, one of the active PCs wants to go from a wants to go from a rezoning from a public facility to a CC2. That's a district map change. You can have a zoning change that doesn't affect the map. Could be language of the code.
So substantial zoning regulation, that sounds to me different than an applicant representing a zone change. Substantial zoning regulation sounds like staff is coming to change as opposed to. So I'm just trying to get rid of the ambiguity and understand what exactly is meant by that.
Great question, and I think that's one of the challenges with the way it's written now is it is ambiguous, and I think we could focus in on the application types that generate the.
So I guess I'll ask, what are you looking for us for today? I gather you're not looking for me to say, I want this ordinance to say substantial zoning regulation and or proposed changes. What you're looking for me to say is, I want it to be mandatory, come back to us with what you think as an ordinance, or I mean, what do you want this committee to tell you?
Great, thank you for the opportunity to clarify. One, that a change is warranted. Two, mandatory or voluntary, and I think there's a couple of answers to that. And if mandatory, what are the types of applications that qualify under mandatory? And I think, Councilmember Scharf, I think you've touched on them. It's the PC, anything that requires the DA from a land use planning and entitlement perspective, general plan amendments, zoning district map changes. I think, and we can give some more thought to whether a zoning code change warrants that as well. I think those are the main ones, and that would capture your specific plans or precise plans. So if I get some nods on that, I can work with the city attorney's office and capture those types of applications. There may be a universe of projects, or you may want to leave open the opportunity for somebody to request a voluntary pre-screening. And one example that I'll mention, and it may strike different chords of the community or committee members, is Maybell. You may have a conforming project on Maybell that meets the zoning standards in the comprehensive plan, but because there's been a history of controversy with that project, a developer may be interested in a pre-screening opportunity, but it won't mandatorily be triggered based on the standards that we have. So there may be some value in having an option for the council to at least have an audience with the developer on that issue.
I think that's very helpful. All right, so you're looking for direction on
Mandatory, voluntary, universe of projects, and then if with your concurrence, I'll work with the city attorney's office to see if we can move the process along more quickly. Right now it's a little cumbersome. It's an ask, the council says yes, it's scheduled for another hearing. The council may say we want to send it to the PTC. If there's clarity on the committee that it should just go straight to the city council, that's helpful. If there's value in sending it to the PTC first before it comes to council, that is good information to know. If you want to keep the option open, that's the way the code's written now, then we can leave that language.
So I guess I see it as that anytime it's a policy decision that's on a broad policy, we should probably start with the council in a pre-screening so that we don't spend a lot of time going through the going through the planning commission process and all that if there's no support for that kind of a concept.
And
if it's a small universe of something, like a specific zoning change, maybe, I'm sort of torn on that.
Yeah.
Because our process is that the PTC does it first, and then they advise us about what they think it should be. and then we do it. So I'm a little torn about how large a universe. I mean, if a developer comes on a PC, it should definitely be mandatory to me, because, if there's a menu of any benefit you want, basically, and the PTC says we should do these 3 benefits, and council thinks we should do 3 different benefits, it's silly for the PTC to then have talked about benefits the council's not interested in.
Correct.
So, but on actual zoning changes, I actually think we should get the benefit. As I'm thinking about this on the fly, I apologize. That as we go through the universe, I actually think that makes sense to, because that's the PTC's job.
Right.
I mean, when it's a defined thing and we're looking at a particular zoning change and the applicant has requested a zoning change as opposed to, frankly, a benefit. I think it's more when benefits are involved. But anyway, I'm going to open it up to my colleagues and let them think about it a little bit too.
Councilmember Schmidt.
Yeah, let me take a little different approach. Why are we here today? Seems to me we're here because of
They'll call the meeting.
101 Linton, 395 Page Mill, 27 University, Maybell, and the grand jury report. A series of things that identified, I think, a critical problem with the existing comp plan. Comp plan, as it appears in the codes and ordinances, is fuzzy, voluntary based, exception filled with ability to get exceptions, bonuses, and incentives that make it very fuzzy to see what the comp plan is telling us. So one basic question is, can we make a decision on this before we know what the revised comp plan is going to be? If, for example, they put in development caps of some type, that might change this completely in terms of what projects have to come. Every project might have to come. So, I think looking at the bigger picture of what we're trying to get here, this piece, has to be consistent and fit in with what we're up to. So, I think a change is certainly useful. I think, of the 5 or 6 things I mentioned here, it was a voluntary basis, and of those, I think you only mentioned one that came out and said.
Yeah.
The grand jury said, gee, something should have been done about 27 University at some point. So I think that first question is answered, yes, something has to be done to clarify. Now, to make a class mandatory, someone from the ARB pointed out, oh, they are doing pre-screening of, every project. But they're doing a pre-screening on a very narrow basis of what is the design component. But the list they have is very long. Can we run the council if we make mandatory pre-screening of 24 projects per year? So I think the identification of which ones are worth pre-screening. Maybe there's something of size, of scale, of impact that could be written into it so that we're not bogged down in an endless process of pre-screening which become all of a sudden the project itself. When you get into details, what is the role of the pre-screening? Is it to I guess have a general sense of what might affect something like the comp plan? How does it fit in really stated what that pre-screening is. Identify issues, let the public see what's going on, and maybe generate some excitement about bigger projects in town and the positive impacts they might have as well as the negative ones. So I see this as a very important thing, but I think it's very important because it fits in the overall process of how do you develop a comp plan, what should the comp plan say, and how does it work itself out through zoning, and what do we do with PCs? You know, how free are we going to be in the comp plan with the notion of PCs, of individual development projects, and public benefits? So I think there is a larger discussion that this has to fit in with. Obviously, we're not doing it here, but it's like a pre-screening, so we can identify what the issues might be, but we don't have the details to
Right.
to read through it. So, 1 and 2 might, I agree with, yes, let's do that. Make it mandatory, make a change, make it mandatory, but what type of change? I think we have to be sensitive to what the grand jury raised. We have to be sensitive to how those 6 projects came through a fuzzy system without clarity of the types of impacts that they were going to generate. And it brings a critical underlying problem of cumulative impacts. You know, if you treat things one at a time, it's hard to get a sense of the cumulative impacts. We've had a very hard time with that issue. So how can this pre-screening, we tell someone in January, oh, this looks great, and by the time September, October come around, we've done that for 10 different projects that have a cumulative impact. How do we recognize that inside this mandatory system? So I'd like it maybe that you're going to come back with some concrete suggestions, but make sure that your suggestions are dealing with these broader issues, and I guess as we go on down the comp plan discussions, that we take into account this as a way of helping make that comp plan effective tool for the comp plan. Okay, I guess that's my first cut.
I had comments. Did you want to respond first?
So I have some comments or observations if it's helpful to your thought process on those points. First, thank you for noting the other projects being new. I'm still developing the universe of projects that influence some of the decisions or actions that we're going forward. So I've noted those properties down. And so thank you for that. And I'll make sure I research those projects to have a broader understanding of the work that we're trying to address. I do believe that what we're talking about is a procedural effort that just sets forth a path for more community dialogue about certain types of projects that have or could have impacts, positive or negative, in the community regarding some key policy issues. While we're proceeding along with the comp plan update, I don't think the procedural aspects of what we're talking about or what qualifies would be largely impacted by decisions made by from the council about policy about development caps or where we want to focus the development. That will those decisions or the thought process leading up to those decisions will inform the council's feedback to a developer through the pre-screening process, which I think, particularly in an era of transition, would be most valuable to a developer. because you've got your existing comp plan and zoning regulations that's what people are working under. If there's a thought that might change, but it hasn't been codified yet or adopted yet on the comp plan, I think to me that really screams to the value of a pre-screening effort.
The procedural issue might be, are we identifying 4 or 5 major projects that'll fit in here, or are there 25 or 30?
So yeah, so to that point, I had a thought on that as well. So the ARB does do pre-screening, and one of the reasons why they have so much pre-screening is there's a provision in the code that gives you 3 opportunities before that board, and after that it's decision time. There's opportunities to extend that if warranted, but the reason why I think you get more pre-screening at the ARB is because people want to have another opportunity before they enter into that process of, okay, I've got 3 more meetings after this pre-screening. If they take that pre-screening and have that first meeting with the ARB, they've only got 2 meetings left to respond to the ARB before the ARB is going to give a recommendation. And the volume of projects that the ARB sees, whether it's a minor or a major ARB, is, I think, substantially greater than the volume of the types of projects that we've articulated here that the council would see, whether it's a PC or a general plan amendment or a zoning code amendment. So, so I have some comfort, and maybe I need to get some data so that the committee has comfort that I don't think this is going to be a burden to the council in terms of getting bogged down in the pre-screening effort. I just don't think the volume's that high. And if it is, I think that tells us something also. If we're getting a lot of requests for pre-screening, we know that we're getting a lot of activity for large policy impacting projects. And that may send another signal to us to at least evaluate some of why are we getting so many? I appreciate the concern, and maybe I can do a little bit more research to allay some of those concerns. And I absolutely agree that the role of the pre-screening process needs to be clearly stated, and I think there's some good language in the zoning code now that we can build on. But I think there's an opportunity for us to clearly state what is expected of applicants, of the council, and the idea of cumulative impacts is Hillary and I have already had some conversations about that, and how do we capture this cumulative impact issue, because that's something that we absolutely need to be focused in on, and being mindful of that through any process that we have. So those are some observations based on your feedback, and I'm happy to elaborate further or thank you.
Thank you. A couple of comments and questions. I'm glad you made the comment about this is a process and procedural issue. I see it as sort of on a parallel but different track than the update for the comprehensive plan, because in fact requests for information or even screening requests will continue during the course of the update of the comprehensive plan. And if we can make this a more understandable process with procedures in place that make sense and it's defensible, then I think that helps everyone. I agree with the comments made about the mandatory for certainly PC and perhaps some of the other categories you mentioned. I do like the idea of having the voluntary option, because that makes the city council, people can have contact and have the opportunity to hear where different council members are coming from in terms of reviewing. The issue of cumulative impact, I agree with your comment. I guess I think there's one thing to mention, that in the pre-screening, there's not a lot of environmental issues coming forward. The initial screening work and environmental assessment has not been completed. And I think to even suggest that kind of information available maybe just needs to be clarified, because, often it's not. The other thing is, in the language that you gave us, the existing code, the one I'm having the most trouble with, and you have touched on it, is 18.79.030.3, any other development project, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I do feel that having criteria is important in terms of that sort of either changing .3 or having well-articulated criteria, because what if all of a sudden everybody wants pre-screening on everything? My concern predictably is the impact on the staff and the impact on the council and the planning commission and everybody. So what's the best use of people's time? I think it's important to have, very critical to have that input, but I think a little bit more criteria so that we're not talking about, just as an absurd example, some little tiny thing that really can be addressed, I think, without the challenges and opportunities and benefit of going to the city council. The other comment was the issue of, when we spoke briefly earlier, we have an ongoing activity regarding the reform of the PC process, and that is still in the mix here, and that is ongoing, and that has no relationship to this process per se. But initially, you made the point earlier today was some of this, could this all be bound together, the pre-screening and the reform of the PC? My gut feeling is I think they are separate. They're important, but they're separate. I think otherwise we're not going to be able to clearly address the issues that come up in both of these, the pre-screening process and the potential PC reform. Okay, so there was other points you made. Let's see. Okay, so this is basically seeking input from us. Do you feel, and perhaps people want to speak some more, do you feel you have sufficient information and some guidance or understanding of where at least the three of us are coming from?
I believe I do, and with the committee's indulgence, I think when we get to the next meeting, there might be a little more fine-tuning that needs to take place, but I think I have I can get us started.
Okay, great. And in your scanning of other practices, you've talked about Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, other places.
Yes.
Where you've, either from your own experience or by looking at others, you can sort of, I'm big on picking the best practices that can be modified to work here.
Great.
If you think that's appropriate.
Yeah, I'm happy to explore that further and see what other communities do when they're presented with these types of projects.
Great. Okay. Colleagues, any more comments? Okay. Councilmember Schmidt, Scharf, City Manager Keene.
We're talking about a change which would make it mandatory. In the current code, there's discretion on who initiates.
Right.
Now, by making it mandatory, it means there's no one initiating. It's initiated by the code.
Yeah, the applicant would have to go through that, would have to file a pre-screening before filing any applications.
Okay.
Could I hear from the city manager, then I'll speak?
Okay, City Manager Keene.
Thank you. I have some more general comments. They're not directed to, but a little bit responding to Councilmember Scharf's initial attempts to kind of get clear what sort of should be in and out, and then the concerns you were, I mean, ultimately, we don't want to devolve to something where the city council is working at the development center, taking in applications and deciding what ought to happen there.
I have some free time.
Okay. If you want to do that.
Absolutely prevent that from
But I just think there's been a lot of confusion, really, still ongoing about 27 University and some of these different projects, and I still think we should be clear about roughly what your pre-screening is generally trying to talk about, right? Which is, in particular, giving important feedback that could early on change the direction of a project, or could even say, don't bother with this project in some way. So a project like 101 Lytton, will those ultimately still go through a public process? They got approved. It's a little bit different if somehow you had saw it and said, just don't even do this project, we don't want to see it. Or you're adding some explicit criteria now. 27 University, we didn't even have an application. In many ways, I'm sorry to say, I'm stretching a little bit, but we were in a pre-screening process. We went to the council twice for direction in public to look at how this project might unfold before an application even comes in. So that's why getting clear about what pre-screening really means is important. Is there explicit criteria when you're talking about cumulative impacts? Is there a degree of change on a comprehensive plan or something that might be required? So I think this is in some ways this is trying to ultimately add specific criteria about what the thresholds are to meet. Last one I would give an example on is 395 Page Mill, the J. Paul project. That was a project that ultimately was withdrawn. Would pre-screening in some way have maybe sort of not wasted developers' time and the city's time in processing through the process and just sort of said no? Maybe yes, maybe no. I would still say there was a lot of information out there in the public realm about that project, I mean, including drawings and all of those sorts of things. So I think that how you do really focus it with the criteria and the objectives you're ultimately looking for will be important so that we meet the intention that you're setting out to do versus confusing things. So thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate your comment.
One question, definitional question. Chapter 18.79 talks about development projects, doesn't talk about application. Is a development project only started with an application? My understanding is now pre-screening gets some conversations going before there's an application. So are we talking about a pre-screening at that point or only after a formal application?
Oh, no, you're talking about both before a formal application and or even after a formal application, I thought is the way you're looking at this. So the judgment period about how to do that. But again, as I just say on 27 University, there was a decision made to go to council before the application was submitted.
So is that what you're, when you talk mandatory,
Right.
you're talking before the application?
So the way the code reads today, you can do there is that option to submit before you file, or if you have filed before a public hearing, you could also request the pre-screening opportunity. If there's a mandatory component, then that would occur before the filing of any discretionary applications.
Yeah, okay, that's my understanding.
Yeah.
Right.
This gives an opportunity early in the game to get cards on the table.
Councilmember Clark?
Yeah, so that's actually very helpful, that discussion. So the way we see this working is if it's mandatory, and first of all, I think when I look at this, it only applies to projects. I think that's the only thing that makes sense. I mean, I don't think there should be pre-screening of stuff that's not a project. So to Chair Price's point, on 18.79030, that's the existing law.
Right.
And the existing law has any other development project, and we've had virtually no pre-screenings.
And it's so fuzzy and vague.
It's fuzzy and vague, so I don't actually have a problem with it being fuzzy and vague for people who want to voluntarily submit, because our experience from the data shows that no one submits voluntarily, or very few people. We've only had 4, I guess you said. So we're not going to be overwhelmed by it. I don't see that happening. Whereas if we make it mandatory on any other development project, I think that's too broad if we make it mandatory. So I think 1 and 2, as they apply to development projects, is fine. But I guess I just want to make sure I understand that substantial zoning regulation or district map change proposals is basically for a project you would have a zoning change, which means you would be within the comprehensive plan, but you would ask for a zoning change.
Right. That could be to the text or to the map.
Right. So I just wanted to make sure that that's what we're talking about. So a map change, what is a map change?
So that's if you wanted to shift a zoning boundary, for instance,
So if I have a piece of property,
change the zoning on a property.
so is it just what I was going to ask you, isn't it just changing the zoning
Yeah.
on a property?
Yeah.
So,
But you could change the boundaries if you're doing lot merge, you're doing a whole bunch of things.
So you can change lot boundaries.
so why would lot boundaries necessarily come to us? I mean,
They wouldn't. They wouldn't.
I'm actually thinking it should be, if I have a project and I want to go from RM1 to RM15, RM15 to RM30, or RM30 to RM40, that seems like something that maybe should come to us. Maybe. But, and that's why I'm just wondering if it shouldn't speak just clear and say, you know, a project applicant wants to change the zoning. I'm not gonna try and write it, but I mean, it seems very vague to me, and maybe I just don't understand the standard.
Greg, I guess we've talked about on the El Camino corridor, we're trying to create incentives for people to consolidate lots. Now, they might be consolidating across zoning boundaries. Does every one of them then have a mandatory
Will they be
pre-screening?
changing zone?
Well, you're consolidating and you presumably will change the map.
So you can consolidate properties and span zoning boundaries. So it doesn't necessarily result in a map or a code change. But the consolidation of properties themselves, depending on where it is in the city, could have policy implications on the character of the neighborhood that we're.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm gonna raise the question of, do we wanna make a motion, frankly, and have a clear direction to what to do? Do we want it to go directly to council after this? Do we need to have it come back and, you know, basically nitpick the statute? I mean, I sort of know what I would suggest goes to council, but maybe we're not all there. So I'm gonna raise that as, you know, I mean, to me, it seems that you wanna make it mandatory, have a voluntary option, and that you wanna basically apply it to projects, and you wanna get rid of the vague one for mandatory, which is 3. So you wanna have,
Well, you want to have some criteria for, rather than just saying other projects, you want to have some criteria, possibly.
for the voluntary option,
Yeah, for
do you
that
really?
point 3.
for the voluntary
Is
option?
that the one?
Greg, I thought Jonathan, when he introduced it, said that he was going to listen to comments tonight and then come back to us with more specific
I'm just
language.
raising about whether or not that's necessary. You know, that turns this into a study session. I don't think this is that difficult an issue, frankly. I mean, I think you could go directly to council, frankly, after this. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it seems that we're pretty much in agreement. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Maybe we're not in agreement. Maybe we want to see
That's
it.
right, it's just the
And I'm just trying to
details.
understand if we're in agreement or if we're not in agreement. I didn't hear anyone say they don't want to have a mandatory component and they don't want to have a voluntary component, unless I missed something.
I have made comments about point 3 regarding, do we need other criteria developed by the staff that defined any other development? Because it is my belief that whatever historically has happened is fine and dandy. We're in a different environment now. The economy's been, you know, changing and, you know, et cetera, in a political environment, et cetera, we don't know. There suddenly may be a whole bunch of pre-screening requests, and we have to be ready for them. If that happens, it may not happen. I just think that keeping the language like that is very, very, very general.
No question, but if you're talking about a voluntary one, we've now hit the universe of almost all projects that have a discretionary nature. So if you're going to allow a voluntary concept, you have to let people say, it doesn't fit within the mandatory, which are the clear ones, then,
But this is under the mandatory, is it not? Am I missing
no, this
something?
is, right now, this is the voluntary. So right now, this is the current statute that exists, that's
But we're
voluntary.
asking him,
So we're asking to make it mandatory. What I heard other people say is 1 and 2, but not 3, and it's 1 and 2 plus PC projects and development agreements. That's what I heard.
yeah,
And that's why I'm suggesting that we take a motion so we're all clear here, because I'm not so sure that we're all clear.
Well, are we, I guess it's not clear to me, B, C, D, are we haven't commented on that. Do you want us to comment on that or not? I guess I agree with the issues of making several of these mandatory, but the voluntary, I mean, it's, any other development projects is, am I missing something? Extraordinarily vague here,
Well, I think you are missing something, to be honest.
including a major alteration or expansion. I mean, is that, are you saying take that out or refine it? I mean, what are you saying on
So
that?
what I'm saying is, this is the current law that's voluntary. I'm actually
yes, it is,
suggesting
it
that
is,
you
I'm sorry,
leave the
it is.
voluntary
Yeah,
with the option for people to come forward voluntarily. And I actually don't mind the voluntary part the way it's currently written. I mean, I actually
okay,
think
you don't
it's,
think that, right, correct.
because it's voluntary.
But-
On the mandatory, I
yes,
think you need
yes.
to narrow the universe to what's mandatory to
Oh, yeah.
specific
No,
things.
No,
And I
agree
think
with
we
that.
all agreed with
No,
that.
I agree with that.
And what I heard people saying was pretty simple. It was, you know, the zoning changes, which is one. Two is comprehensive plan amendments, including specific plans. And then three was PC projects and development agreements. And that should be the universe of what's mandatory.
Yes, no, I agree with you.
And
I
then-
was looking at something.
Right, no, I know, that's what I
Yeah,
mean.
and I guess in this, I mean, if it's voluntary, it's just, the language bothers me.
It's the
just
current,
so broad.
it's the current law. And the
Yeah,
question is,
no.
I mean, if anyone wants to change the voluntary, I'm suggesting we leave the voluntary
Yeah.
exactly the way it is.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't mind if you
'Cause it's
wordsmith it and say
voluntary.
it makes more sense, but in general, that's the voluntary.
yeah.
And then,
The mandatory is.
and the
defined, as we
mandatory
talked
is
about. I
defined
agree.
really simple.
I agree.
And so, I guess I would make that motion that you take that and you go directly to council with it.
Does that mean it goes on consent?
No, it does not go on consent, because he's drafting an ordinance and no one will have seen it.
So
Including us.
if I may interject, so this is a change to the zoning code. So you will need the Planning and Transportation Commission to make a recommendation to the council before the council can introduce a first reading of the ordinance.
And I would suggest it goes to the Planning and Transportation Commission.
And you feel you have sufficient information to do that?
So, yeah, I mean, I think if there's consensus on the committee, I think I have a clear understanding, and I'm happy to restate just briefly what that is. And it's a mandatory program for certain types of projects that we've identified, and the
Zoning.
zoning changes. So my list, I have plan communities, development agreements, general plan amendments, zoning text amendments, zoning district map amendments, and maybe there's a question on the zoning text amendment one, but those are the ones that,
Land use designations or-
yeah, anything that would affect,
In there.
anything that would affect specific plans, land use designations. So these are things that relate to height, density, you know, the key issues that would be worthy of conversation. Retaining a voluntary mechanism for a project that does not meet that standard, and mirroring to some degree what we have here. And I guess my one question that I would ask of the committee is, I believe that we would still want to have the council retain the authority to decline a discussion on a voluntary, so that you can weed out the ones that you don't think rise to the level.
But we don't know. Council will not know.
No, it's like on consent. There's a pre-screening request that's on consent currently.
Oh, requests.
Right.
So,
basically what they do is they put it on consent, and then we can pull it and say, no, we don't want to hear it.
right, and that report would say this is going to go to the PTC for a conversation, and then it would come to the city council for a pre-screening.
Okay, let me ask one question on cumulative impacts. They are not asking for new zoning or a comp plan amendment, but maybe in a particular neighborhood or district they're having parking impacts. They are using bonuses and incentives in a cumulative way in a particular area and having major impacts. That fits into the voluntary.
And council can initiate that.
Yeah, but how can council initiate it if they don't know until it comes to council? It's not on their agenda.
So correct. Under the current zoning code, the council can make a request of an applicant or a prospective applicant that you would like to have a pre-screening. That's under the current code. So the way the council would find out is a developer may approach a council member. That's the current system. But
No one, the council does not know.
okay. So to answer your question about cumulative impacts, and when I hear cumulative impacts, that's a very precise technical term that in my mind is related to CEQA and how you evaluate the impacts of a project to transportation networks, parking availability, scale, character of neighborhoods, and things of this nature. Cumulative impacts to air quality and all the things that you would look at in an environmental document. I think there's another layer which we would not be able to assess through the pre-screening process because we have not done the cumulative impact analysis for the project. However, I do believe that a comment that I could anticipate likely being heard by the, expressed by the council is that, hey, this is an interesting project. Be mindful of the fact that there are 5 other projects in the general vicinity, and we will be looking at the cumulative impacts through the environmental review process, and that could modify or refine the comments that you've heard expressed at the pre-screening meeting. And there's a lot of, I'll say,
Who's going to say that?
so a council member could say that. I think that,
Council member can't say it if it's not on the agenda.
well, it would be part of a, if you're having a pre-screening conversation about a project, and you happen to know because you get updates from us about what's happening, our pending projects list, you may know that in the vicinity of a project that's being presented to you as a pre-screening, that there's a number of other projects in close proximity, within a half mile. I mean, you just will know that. And if you don't have access to that information, that's information that we can provide to you via maps and information. That should be okay. So we can geocode sort of the location of these properties, and that can be a part of a staff report too. I mean, that seems pretty straightforward to provide that. So you'll want to be mindful of. So a developer who's coming forward, staff certainly would articulate this as well, that your project is being evaluated with the understanding that there are other projects that have previously been entitled. There are pending projects being entitled, seeking entitlement, and all of the impacts of those projects are being evaluated and assessed in the environmental documentation. Any prospective applicant would want to be mindful of that and need to know that their project could be impacted by that.
Any developer who's any good would know that.
I'll refrain from comment. But but there's another layer, I think, of cumulative impacts that I think gets closer to the qualitative issues and more of the policy issues. Maybe not an environmental impact, but a neighborhood quality consideration, such as there's parking deficiencies in the area, or we're concerned about certain aspects from a community perspective. Those are the types of comments I think are valuable for a developer to receive through a pre-screening process. And staff certainly tries to advise people on that, but the council is a little bit closer, I think, to what the community is saying, and those are the types of comments I think are particularly valuable in a pre-screening effort.
Yeah, maybe something like RPP neighborhoods could have an alert sign on new developments.
A listserv of information, or what are you saying? Alert sign? There are already so many alerts, Greg.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get in. We're making it, voluntary. We're losing
So people
the
know the process is available, and that would be something we would tell the community if we got these revisions made and it move forward. Yeah. Okay, so the decision of going straight to council or not, do we have some general feeling about that? Is that part of your motion?
So I'll make the motion. You guys can decide to second it or amend it, just
Okay.
for clarity. I'll make the motion that we draft the ordinance up, the changes, and go to the PTC, because that's the next step. That's what he needs to do.
Yeah, we mentioned before.
That he goes to the PTC, and that we have a voluntary ordinance, which is very similar to the existing ordinance, and the only changes would be is that you would take out the parts that have now become mandatory, because there's no reason to have the mandatory part in the voluntary part. Otherwise, the voluntary part would stay exactly the same as it is. The mandatory part would be for projects in which there is a zoning change proposed, a comprehensive plan amendment, including specific plans, PC projects, and development agreements. And that's been the universe, I believe, of what we've been talking about.
You added a couple other, I think, didn't you?
I don't think so. I think I have it written down like this. Zoning change, comprehensive plan amendment. It's basically what he has on the front
Yeah,
page of the.
you've been consistent. Could I make a friendly amendment?
Well, first I need to get a second. Councilmember Price
I will-
needs to.
I will.
Make sure it is.
I will say a second. But can you get some of Jonathan's wording in the voluntary part?
Say that again.
Instead of
I believe
using,
you suggested that the voluntary language be similar to
Right.
what exists now.
And Jonathan made
Taking out the
a nice
mandatory.
statement
Mhm.
about their ways of alerting to cumulative impacts
Okay.
in certain sensitive areas. And if those could be identified on the voluntary side, that there is an alert that council members or the
So if I may, that seems like a worthy criterion for mandatory or voluntary. I mean, that would be something that you'd want to communicate to a developer if there were issues of concern.
yeah, Greg, is that okay with you?
Well,
That could,
so,
Doesn't-
I know
can
you
butt in
think
for
it's a
second?
worthy thing, and I mean, I get that,
Paul-
right? But I don't understand it.
Could
I
make a
don't
comment?
understand exactly what you mean by that. So, let me
May I
back up a
make
little.
comment for a second?
Oh, sure,
to
sorry.
clarify? No. It's either this report or the other report that says that the typical noticing that goes on would continue. So properties within a certain
Right.
distance of the affected property would be notified of these processes and be notified if there was going to be a piece screening, correct?
yeah, the way the code is set up now, that the underlying development application is the zoning, is the mailing standard.
And that standard would be applied, continues to be applied for pre-screenings, in this case mandatory,
Or voluntary.
whatever it is.
Yes.
And that information will be sent to the community about this change in this process as part of this.
Oh,
Therefore,
so
people would be notified generically
Yes.
about this.
So we would notice it applies broadly to the community. So we would do a newspaper notice and the website. And we are now advertising on Nextdoor, so we would send a Nextdoor notification for items that are going to the PTC.
People would be advised of this change in process, and the typical noticing requirements would be done for properties or projects for pre-screening.
So yes, and I just want to be clear. So we'll do the standard noticing requirements for amending the code.
Yep.
And then as somebody who's availing themselves to this process would be subject to the noticing standards that are set forth in the code. Okay.
That's already true. I guess you were getting where I was. Isn't that
Yeah.
already true?
That is true.
Yes, true.
So that doesn't take a change to the code.
No.
So
Noticing doesn't take a change to the code.
what Councilmember Schmidt wants, that's what I was trying to understand, is I believe that's already in our code.
It is.
That is, yes, but I thought you were saying something different.
So, and I apologize if I misunderstood some of the communication across the table. I thought that there was an interest in advising prospective applicants up front that the pre-screening analysis, if you will, that the council and the PTC, if it goes to them first, will be mindful of the fact that there may be some neighborhood-specific issues that are relevant to a particular project. And that will inform the types of comments that are delivered to
So I
an
feel like
applicant.
you're confusing the issue with all respect.
Okay, please
I
clarify.
do. I mean, I
Please.
feel like, as a council member, if it comes to us on a pre-screening, we can always make those comments. Councilmember Schmidt's points were if you have a voluntary one,
Mhm.
which we wouldn't see, right? You would like, and that's the part I'm confused. Are you trying to say that they should be? If it's voluntary and the people come to us, then you know about it, it comes,
Let me
It's
give
that.
a concrete example.
give it, okay, fine.
We have spent 9 months trying to work downtown parking issue. And there seems to be a surplus of something like 1,600 cars on the streets. The base zoning of the downtown is an FAR board. With all the bonuses and incentives that are currently in play, the average zoning of the downtown becomes 3 instead of 1. Now, that's a potential issue between the FAR and the cars. So an individual, single developer comes in and says, oh, I'm going to use these exceptions and these bonuses and do this. And it doesn't break 3 or 4 of them come in over a period of time, all of a sudden you blow apart the parking program we had. So I want there to be the ability of the planning department to put an alert. Gee, in this parking district, we have a deficit of, X number, and we have to be sensitive about each one of these projects.
So I think the problem I'm having with your example is that what you're saying is someone has a building that they're gonna build as of right in the downtown. And as of right means it's within the zoning, they're not seeking anything from us. Our procedure is that they don't need a pre-screening, they go to ARB. Because they have a right to build it, it becomes about design. So therefore, I don't understand sending out an alert that says, these people have an absolute right to do this. We as a council can do nothing about it. Because they have a right to do it. It's within the zoning, and their object is to go to ARB, but yet this could make parking worse in your neighborhood, so you should show up and complain about it. I mean, I don't get that.
One of the reasons why we're here talking about pre-screening.
No, we're talking about
is to
pre-screening.
Identify issues that have taken months and months of time of the planning department to grapple with.
Right, but they're not as of right development.
Exacerbate them, we want to help them identify a potential problem.
Right, but on as of right development, you don't have a choice. You can't say no. That's the point. And if you do think, that's why we're looking at downzoning. At least that's the way I understand it, is we're looking at downzoning. So, I mean, we already have all these notice provisions. I just don't understand how you could say, and how would you know, Councilmember Schmidt? So one person puts in a project that they're gonna develop downtown as of right. I mean, they're within the zoning and all of that. Do we send an alert to the neighborhood that says, we do it anyway. We have all these noticing provisions and all that. I mean, it's not like I get these, so it's already getting all that stuff. But do you want something extra that says, alert, alert, danger Will Robinson? I mean,
No cumulative assessment, ongoing assessment. We use the VTA, for example, in traffic. And the VTA assumes, 1% road freedom.
Yeah, I think,
as a context.
I think we're sort of moving a bit sideways here, but Director Gittleman,
Thank you.
please make comment.
Welcome, Director Gittleman.
Hillary Gittleman, the planning director. First, I want to say how fantastic it is to have Jonathan here, who prepared these reports and is working with you on these issues this evening. But I did want to interject and say, I think, two things. First, I think we're talking about something that is already provided for in the ordinance. The ordinance, as it's currently written, and this is not proposed to change, in section 050, talks about city staff preparing for the pre-screening hearing by doing some basic analysis and providing what input we have on environmental issues, among other things. So in that context, I think we have the ability to highlight issues of concern. In the pre-screening, that's correct. I think that's already provided for in the ordinance itself. Now, if I can address...
But it would be for voluntary and mandatory.
It's for both. It's in section 050 of the ordinance.
But it's only if they voluntarily ask for pre-screening.
That's not the way I read this. If we're going to change the ordinance to require a mandatory pre-screening, this section about the conduct of the hearing would apply to both the mandatory and the voluntary pre-screening efforts.
I'm sorry, I'm concerned about the initiation of it. If it's mandatory, it has to be done. If it's on the voluntary side, it's initiated by the developer. The developer has no incentive to initiate something which would say, oh, we can't do that.
I can tell you, Councilmember Schmidt's concerned about as-right development not doing a pre-screening when you would like to have a pre-screening for an as-of-right development, and I'm saying there's no reason to do an as-of-right. But that's what this argument's really about. It's as-of-right development. Councilmember Schmidt wants a pre-screening for that, or at least an alert to the neighbors or something that's above and beyond what we currently do. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, the as-of-right includes the bonuses and incentives and so on that are hidden away. But it also includes something on the cumulative side.
If if I can interject on the whole cumulative issue. I mean, I think this word gets bandied around a lot, and we have an obligation under the California Environmental Quality Act to consider cumulative impacts. We have done so in the downtown. The downtown is actually capped. We have a cap on square footage, and we did an analysis when that cap was created of the cumulative impacts. Now, that doesn't mean we all don't have concerns and issues and quality of life issues that require careful consideration as projects come forward. But I don't want anyone to think that we've, quote, ignored cumulative impacts or don't consider them as a routine matter. We're also engaged in quite an elaborate and time-consuming effort in our comprehensive plan update to refresh the cumulative analysis that we've done for the city as a whole. And I think we're going to have a lot more information about that coming forward. This pre-screening process, this ordinance that's set up, that you're talking about making some, I think, worthy adjustments to, is in order to allow the city and applicants a path to get an early read on projects. It's intended for projects that have some potential for controversy and rise above the ordinary, perfectly, by right or routine matters that are heard in the course of the ARB and other boards and commissions. So it really is intended for another class of projects. And I understand you want to split them into some mandatory, some voluntary, but there's no, the whole world would grind to a halt if we tried to apply this process to every kind of routine project that we work on.
Which includes every house that could be built in addition, technically.
I'm seconding where you were originally, and but the intention here, and you've described this very well, in terms of what changes we're looking at here to provide the value of the pre-screening exercise, not to everything, including what's allowed by right. That's my second to Member Sharp.
Okay, if I could just make one comment. I'm skeptical of pushing ahead on that because in the downtown we have a annual monitoring report of a parking deficit that has continually said year after year that the parking deficit is about 800. We've been running this set of hearings, public hearings, over the last 6 months about trying to get an accurate measurement of the deficit, and the number keeps coming up with 1,400 or 1,600. Now, that's a big gap, and I'm just concerned we don't want to put in place a pattern of assessment that allows that type of discrepancy.
Could I just add, we have a series of existing laws and regulations that govern the downtown. We have zoning, we have established setbacks, we have height limits, we have an actual overall development cap themselves, all of which together are established to regulate and, of course, ultimately cap what can happen in the downtown. If you're talking about doing something that really is beyond that, as we keep coming back to me, that's a very different conversation, as I think Councilmember Scharf indicated. If we want to talk about downzoning existing entitled properties, and that's a different conversation than how we would take folks to a pre-screening. That's a very different process, because we would be going to a pre-screening and we would end up saying, well, everything that is proposed is actually provided for and in compliance. So again, I'm restating what has been said. Without looking for zoning changes or some of the other kinds of criteria or issues you've identified, it actually, I'm with the folks who've said it would be very confusing to the public as to why that has come to the council, in addition to really inefficient as it relates to what you're doing. And if you really want to do that, we ought to shift to the other conversation, not today, but at some other time. How do you want to manage this? Not through pre-screening, but you want to change.
I actually wanted to say that I actually agree with Councilmember Schmidt in terms of his concerns. I mean, I think we as a council, and I think if you look at what we did last night,
And I think it's important to say, so there's no confusion in the public, what we did last night is we asked the director to come back to us to get rid of more parking exemptions. So, that's where that conversation occurs. But I do think the public needs to understand, I worry frankly that you made your comments that make it seem like we have any control over if someone comes to us with a project that's within zoning, they have a right to build it. If we don't like it and the public doesn't like it, we need to, earlier than before they come to us, and to look at it on a comprehensive basis within the legal framework of what we're allowed to and how we're allowed to zone, and say, this is what we want. We can't spot zone on an ad hoc basis and say, oh, you want to build, now we're going to down
Impact are
zone.
really on the edges of an application if it meets the development standard.
I think we're in agreement that the real discussion has to be around the comp plan and how we set those general rules.
Okay, we have a motion, we have a second.
Should we vote?
Are we ready to vote? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, 2 in favor, 1 opposed, 1 absent. Thank you, very helpful.
But I am happy to move ahead with the discussion.
All right, well, thank you for that.
Is that your first
That's
committee?
one.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay,
Yep.
committee item number 2.
Okay, yes, okay. So the next.
Well, you get to do the next one too.
Yeah.
Welcome to Palo Alto.
You've been very lucky. Agenda item number 3, discussion of updating the seismic safety chapter of the municipal code for hazardous buildings. And if we could have a staff report.
Thank you, and I'll welcome George Hoyt, who is the city's building official. We've been collaborating on this project together, and I want to thank him for his efforts in drafting the report. And I also want to thank the City Council for bringing this important issue to our attention. It was on, I believe, September 15th when the council received the OES's Threats and Hazards report, where some of the issues were identified regarding seismically vulnerable buildings. And it was at that meeting that the council directed staff to begin identifying and prioritizing buildings that pose a potential hazard, to review best practices from other communities regarding how they've addressed these types of buildings, and to review any current legislation that may have any impact in how we might want to regulate this in the future. Our current ordinance was adopted in 1986, and one of the notable things, and that was a voluntary program, it did establish a mandatory reporting requirement, but making the seismic upgrades were voluntary. Notable about that ordinance was that it identified 3 categories of building types. One was unreinforced masonry buildings, and the other 2 categories had to do with the age the building was constructed, or the year that it was constructed, and the occupancy. And those types of building topologies are just not, they're unconventional to contemporary standards for how you might evaluate this kind of an issue. So in reviewing the ordinance, it seems that one of the things that we would want to do minimally is at least conduct an inventory and evaluate what kinds of buildings we have in the community that might be seismically vulnerable. And we've identified some of those as, and the council's identified this as well, as continuing to look at unreinforced masonry buildings, which I believe we have a good inventory on that, soft story buildings, concrete tilt-up buildings, and steel moment frame types of construction. The report outlines some best practices used in other communities. I'm happy to talk about that further. The process that municipalities go through to adopt this type of ordinance is pretty typical. The city develops an inventory. We notify property owners. There's usually a consultant who is hired to conduct that inventory and review engineering reports that property owners would submit to demonstrate the vulnerabilities of the buildings and the retrofitting needs to make it compliant with contemporary standards. And then there's appeal processes by which owners could appeal to a committee to have the property not listed because of some unknown upgrades that maybe have already occurred or other reasons. So for the for today's discussion, what we're principally looking for from the committee is to, one, I guess, understand the existing program that we have in place today. And based on that program, those insights, do you support the idea that we should reevaluate the ordinance? And if so, staff would recommend that updating the inventory would be a necessary first step to collect the data that we need to inform a prioritization schedule for how we would address seismically vulnerable buildings. Secondarily to that, and we don't have to answer these questions tonight, but it would be helpful for us if the committee could highlight any concerns that it might have with respect to this type of an ordinance. The idea of voluntary or mandatory is something that we'll need to, a discussion we'll need to have at some point. And there will be some difficult decisions as the council and the committee and the council and the community evaluate the need to reduce the risk to property and life against the high costs of retrofitting buildings, and it can be significant in many instances. And then once we get past all that, there's conversations about enforcement and incentives, which I think are particularly helpful to encourage people to upgrade buildings, particularly if you have a voluntary program. So I'll end there, and happy to answer any questions that you have.
May I ask just about the clarifying question? So, thank you, Jonathan. So, for number one, do we have, do we have an estimate, or do we have knowledge or information about, well, number one, what it takes to update the inventory?
So we, consulting other communities that we've worked with and a firm in the Bay Area, our best guess at this point is $100,000 to do a citywide inventory. Excuse me, we would not recommend including single-family homes or duplexes or triplexes. I mean, I think what we typically see in other communities is 5 units or more as being a threshold for where you begin that analysis. That's obviously up for discussion. You'll see in the report San Francisco does 3 or more units. So that's a conversation. But about $100,000, and just I want to communicate that there's some latitude in there, but that's not a precise number.
And
quick comment, and my understanding is 100,000 from what you've said and from page 7 of the report is not only inventory, but asking the consultant then to review the engineering reports, assist in prioritization of buildings, and provide guidance for a new or revised ordinance. So it's sort of 2 parts.
Yeah, and
that 100,000 is a global number for these 2 parts.
that's the idea.
Estimated.
And I want to stress that it's an estimate.
And I would just like to add one other thing then to that, and then turn it fully over to the committee, is that I would want to be sure that depending upon what direction the committee has, when we go to the council, we're in a position to also estimate what it does take for us, we think, from a resource perspective and time to do this. Having been through this issue in another Bay Area city, it's not, it's potentially a very big deal, so we need to get clear about that.
Yeah, it's hard not to be enthusiastic about dealing with the potential problem here as a part of our emergency preparedness. And it is striking how successful the current code has been with the buildings identified. That you have something like, 75–80% have done the modifications. I assume you're asking for 2 things with the RFP. One, you're asking to broaden the definition of what is looked at, and then 2, to go out and look. And the broadening of the definition would be the last 2 pages of the report, where here, instead of achieving 80% compliance, you have 5% compliance. And these are the living units, multiple family living units. Is that correct?
Yeah, so define the building typologies that we would want to study, and they're listed on page 7 of the report, packet page 26. And yes, and then go out and evaluate that.
Now, there's no numbers on financing here.
Right.
Do you have any estimate?
So that's the $100,000.
No, that's for the RFP.
Oh, so for once we get the data,
Yeah.
for those, oh,
These people.
To repair those
Yeah.
buildings. I really don't have an estimate on what that would range. The buildings ranging in size. Some are 3-unit buildings, some are more like 20-unit buildings. So I could reach out and get some estimates for you, if that would make you comfortable.
I'm just wondering what this might do to our housing availability in town. If
Right.
we have a mandatory program and say in 2 to 4 years you have to do it, and these people look around and say, gee.
Where do I get the money? Yeah, it's definitely something we need to consider.
When does it get considered? Right now, or?
no, I think there's more data that we need to collect before we have that conversation. I think part of the inventory is finding out how many residential units and the size of those developments are impacted, and then sort of putting our heads together to see how we can encourage or facilitate or incentivize rehabilitation.
Will the firm going out and doing the assessment do some assessment of cost of repair?
It is a possible component that we could add in the RFP.
It'd be an additional component.
Additional cost, additional component.
Probably be rough because you don't know until you actually get it.
And do the design, yes.
I think what we did in the past was we had the property owners prepare a structural report and cost estimates for the work. So that's kind of like a second tier analysis that we did before, and I think is generally the model that we were looking at now. Once we get that analysis done, we would ask property owners to submit reports to us to say in greater detail what are the structural deficiencies. You're on our list as being one of these types of buildings. Now we need you to look at your building, do your analysis, and report back on the retrofitting requirements.
Is it an on and off list, or is it category 1, category 2, category 3 safety?
So and George can respond as well. I think maybe what we're looking at is moving away from the category list that we have now to more building topology, but then having a conversation about prioritization, and maybe there's a tiered approach thereafter that we would talk about where do we need to focus our energies first.
Okay, good, thank you.
And for the record, could you introduce yourselves again?
Sure.
People hear you talking out your
Sure.
field.
I'm George Hoyt, the Chief Building Official for the City of Palo Alto.
And I'm Jonathan Lates, Assistant Director to the Planning and Community Environment Department.
I'm also excited about this. I think of all the people that live in those buildings that are unsafe, I worry about it. I think we have an obligation to fix this. I also think that we have to say, yes, it has been very successful, the program, but there's like 23 owners, and it's likely to be less successful in the future because they're the ones that haven't changed it over a long time since I think we did this in '86, right? So it's been a long time, and we've actually made the program less attractive because we've taken away the parking, if I recall, right? Which was the big incentive to do this. I'm actually in favor of a mandatory program. No question about that in my mind. I am much more interested in a mandatory program for office and residential, especially residential. People are much more likely to be sleeping there at night and not be able to get out. I'm concerned about that. I have some concern, frankly, about things like the SOS grocery, frankly. I think a big cost on that would probably drive the SOS grocery out of business, would be my guess. So on things like retail, especially, it's a small building, it's a funky little retail building. So I think we should prioritize residential and commercial over retail, frankly. I feel a little way about that about Mills the Florist, who's in their building, which is one of those buildings as well. Again, it's just a retail building. I have a hard time believing that a florist could absorb those kind of costs that it would take. Or that an owner wouldn't basically say, okay, I need to demolish the building or do something. So I'm much more concerned about how that works on the retail. I probably would go for 3 units rather than 5 units. I mean, I think if you choose to live in a 4-unit, you should still feel safe at night when you sleep. And, you know, I've been through several earthquakes in my life. And most of them, I recall, happened early in the morning or in the evening. And I remember as a kid in Los Angeles in the big earthquake, I forget, it was like 71 earthquake, right? I remember my bed just flying across the room. I mean, that's how I woke up. I mean, the bed's like flying across the room. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, it's one thing for the bed to fly. It's another thing if the building came pancaking down like that. And so I do think we need to take care of this. When we look at this, I guess I was a little confused as to, you said it's a lot of staff time and stuff, Jim, and I'm a little, we have, I mean, that staff time is what, going ahead and doing the inventory, getting the new inventory, or what's?
I just want to make sure that both doing the inventory, but attempting to anticipate, you know, just what the process support might be, since it's just, this is a new work item on a department that's already overloaded with a lot of stuff. So I just think we need to acknowledge that, so that if there are any other adjustments that need to be made, or if we ultimately need to supplement with any other different staffing or outside consulting assistance, we ought to just do that. I don't know what that is right now. I just wanted to put it on the record. We may need to do that.
Part of the staff report in response to the inventory, the concept of prioritization, engineering reports. Right.
So, again, you're looking for us to go ahead and recommend the full council authorize an immediate request for proposals to do an updated inventory, right? And that's because you said you want to do building topology rather than these 3 categories, which we no longer believe are appropriate, right?
Well, we believe that they covered a very large basis of it. The larger URM structures, we still have smaller URM structures that are under 1,900 square feet. The other 2 categories were created with important dates related to updating codes for different situations in response to earthquakes for larger occupants in commercial buildings. But we still have a lot of smaller commercial buildings that have the same dangerous components that haven't been reviewed. We have soft story structures which haven't been reviewed. And I'm not sure that we've captured all the tilt-up structures or the non-ductile structures.
So what you're looking for us today, Frank, is to go and say, recommend the full council authorize an immediate, right? Request to repair and update inventory and to customize an approach for sizably upgrading the city's most vulnerable buildings. So,
And the scope of services needs to include the points made on page 7. So it's more than just the inventory.
okay. On page 7, which is right there. Oh, yes, okay. All right, so that's what you're looking at. So in terms of some of the things that struck me on this as well, I was really surprised that the President Hotel, I mean, it's 80 feet tall, roughly, one of the tallest buildings there, has not been seismically upgraded. That struck me as a very dangerous condition. I mean, so I actually would prioritize tall buildings. I mean, I think that's what we did before, and make that mandatory and make that come into compliance, you know, fairly quickly. So I mean, I think that there's differences in the buildings and differences in the danger.
So degree of risk.
The degree of risk, I think that's right. So I think we should definitely take the degree of risk into consideration. I actually wanted a little clarification, not at the moment, but later from Councilmember Schmidt again. You said that you had some concerns about doing the residential buildings, and I was unclear why you had the concern.
No, it's just a question about it. Since voluntarily done virtually nothing over the lifetime of this. And these are buildings that have lots of people in them,
Right.
over 3,000 occupants. And to do something going to raise rents maybe quite dramatically in some cases. So I'm just,
So passing on the cost and potential temporary displacement.
So I mean, I think the temporary displacement could be a real issue as they do the work. But I don't know, I think we should look at that issue a little bit. I mean, I think a lot of this is strengthening those
I
buildings,
know a lot
right?
of the retrofits that have been done that have been identified under these soft story structures were done with the buildings occupied.
That's what I was gonna ask you.
Yes.
And
So
I
it's
think,
not in all cases, but many cases.
Yes.
Good. That's good.
yeah. So we need data to
Right.
make intelligent decisions.
right, I just think that's an important data point.
Okay.
We do. You know, I'm not sure that it raises rents, frankly. I think what raises rents is lack of supply, and landlords tend to go to the market,
You can
frankly.
also pass cost to the poor old tenant.
Well,
Yes,
yeah
they
and
can.
no. I mean, the answer is you can only pass the cost if you can get more rent for the, so I can tell you that if you put a new roof on your building, you can't pass that cost. You put a new Corian tabletop, you know, and a new gas
I don't know.
stove,
Maybe.
you can pass the cost, because it makes the, people are willing to pay more for that.
Every landlord's doing.
So, but I do think this is a life safety issue. In fact, you know, if you have a big earthquake and people die because of these buildings, I'm gonna feel pretty bad about it, you know, that we could have done something. So, I would like us to see us move forward.
With the reference to the scope of services.
Yeah, no, I would,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I wasn't gonna make a motion till I thought everyone should
Okay.
get to talk,
Okay,
unless,
so that's the
you should make the
concept.
motion.
Yeah, that's good. No, that's the concept. Do people have any other comments? Yeah, I think several questions have been raised and comments made. I've also jumped in a few times, and I think that this is very helpful, and I agree completely on the health and safety issue, and I appreciate this is brought to our attention. Members of the community have also raised these issues and expressed concern over the years. So, yeah, I would support the preliminary motion that you made with the amendments related to the scope of services.
Then I'll make a formal motion that we, so we recommend that the full council authorize an immediate request for proposals to prepare an updated inventory and to customize an approach for seismically upgrading the city's most vulnerable buildings, including and that you update the inventory of structurally deficient buildings in the multifamily, commercial, and industrial areas of the city, categorize buildings topologies including URM, soft story, tilt-up, non-ductile, steel movement, and then that you go ahead and use a consultant if necessary, and whatever those A through I issues are.
Second?
Great. Okay, you want to make a comment to support your motion?
No?
You want to make a comment to support the second?
No, it's just safety is a critical issue in this time.
I want to get Schmidt out of here by 8. I got
Yeah,
1 minute.
yeah.
So,
Okay, very good presentation. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay, 3-0, 1 absent.
so Chair Price, just a point of clarification. I think what would procedurally be nice is if we came back to the council with the response to the RFP,
Well,
the results of the RFP.
So we need, so we were going to go forward because we need the budget, I forget what it's called here, but the budget amendment or the BAO. Or,
Oh, okay.
so we need to get the $100,000 or so. We'll probably do some preliminary scoping of, we'll draft a scope of work, we'll reach out to a consultant.
So all of that was, you
Yep.
can put it on consent, but we as a committee can't give you that authority.
That's right,
It needs
that's
to
right.
go to council.
Okay. So we'll try to refine that cost too. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, good. Thank you. And you wanted to talk about the schedule briefly? We're
We did, and then,
Tuesday on the 16th?
correct, and
Vote yes on 8
and I just,
Finally.
I just really want to,
I move that, let's see, what was it?
Let's talk about a lot of.
I know, that's what I was thinking.
Yes.
I just would really like to thank Jonathan and the Development Services Department and Planning Department. They really brought these two items back within less than 60 working days from when council approved it, given their heavy workload. So
Great job, guys.
Thank you. can tell you all the things we voted on.
Gail, I'm not sure I want to raise that development cap right now.
You have a sense of
Your agenda for next week is, as we talked about, there's going to be an information report on the city council agenda for 12:15 and follow up to the Stanford Development Agreement funds. And so that'll go out on the Monday night agenda. And then we've got the board and commission recruitment changes, the cost analysis of cost of city council and commission minutes, the municipal percent for art policy, and then the annual city council priority setting. Those will all come to you next Tuesday. And then below are other items for 2015, and we'll dive into that as we get into the new year.
All right, and thank you for the support of this committee, I appreciate it. And on this, have you received comments from everybody about their priorities, including me, although I was late?
It's everyone.
Oh, good, I wasn't that fast. Okay. Great,
And we're
okay.
talking about this on the 16th, right?
Right. So, that's it, okay. Meeting adjourned.
Good job, Chair
Okay,
Price.
thank you. Thank you for clarifying on the